Welcome to our VAL-CO how-to video series. Today we're putting together, assembling our new Mach 57 fan. As you can see, we've already started putting our orifice together. There are 4 equal quadrants of the fan that we bolt together as we stand it up. One of the keys to assembling this is you want to start, there are 6 bolts that go around each quadrant, and you want to start by assembling the 2 interior ones first. This helps square everything up and line everything up evenly. The other thing that you want to just finger tighten everything together first as you get all 4 seams of the quadrants put together. Once I put those in, it kind of starts to line everything up, and then you can go back and put your other bolts on. All right, the next step, we're gonna put our damper strut on. Again, only finger tighten after we put our vertical damper strut in, then we will go around and tighten everything with an impact. On the damper strut, there are 2 eye bolts that will be assembled. We've already put those on, tightened them in. As you can see, there's a channel and a point. You want the channel facing to the outside of the fan, which would mean the eye bolts will be pointing towards the inside. And I am standing at the bottom of the fan. You want to make certain that your eye bolts are closer to the bottom. There are 2 sets of holes on the damper strut, and that's because it can be put in either way, but whichever way you put it in, your eye bolts need to be closer to the bottom of the fan. And again, your opened end of your channel is facing out of the fan. Okay, now we're getting the nuts put on our damper strut. And as you can see, there's several holes in here. We're using the bottom 2 holes in this area on the orifice. And all 4 of these orifices have the same exact holes punched out in them, so there's no left or right or up or down. They all will go in everything will be assembled very easily. Okay, so now that we've got our vertical damper strut hand tight bolts in, all the other bolts, we're ready to impact everything in. Again, about the damper strut, we install in this early so that we make sure we keep the proper orifice distance on our fan. We want to start by tightening the middle 2 and work our way out, and always make sure we have a nice smooth flat surface with your seam on the inside and everything is properly lined up. Also, when you're tightening this with your impact, make sure you don't go so tight that you start to crush the fiberglass. One more check, nice and flat and smooth, and then we'll go on and tighten each of the quadrants the exact same way. We're always certain that the inside is nice and flat and smooth and aligned. You may see some slight differences on the outside. The critical area is the inside is nice and smooth and aligned. Okay, so we're going to install our damper magnet catch brackets, and there's 3 of those on each side of the orifice. Now, something that you can do if you'd like is put these in before you tighten your quadrant bolts to tighten and pull everything in, because that can kind of help line this up and keep it flush. So as we put that in, we want to make sure the bend in the bracket is facing up like it is here. We're now going to tighten the nuts for the damper magnet bracket. Tighten that down, and then we've got 3 on each side to go all the way around. So next, we're going to install our damper pivot plate bracket. As you can see, there's a slight bend in it. And there's 2 holes which will line up in these 4 holes right here. The 2 outside holes, you'll slide this in, and then we still have access to the 2 bottom holes. Put our nuts on the back, tighten those down, and there's 1 more of these pivot plate brackets up on the top of the fan, and we'll install it the same way. Okay, our next step is we're going to assemble our X braces, our cross braces, to our bearing plate and our motor mount plate. Now both of these are identical pieces, so whether they're on top or bottom, it doesn't matter. Our motor mount rails or cross supports, however you want to call it, there is a slight difference. There is an up and a down, or a top and a bottom to these. If you notice at the bend, the bolt hole is closer to the bend at what we call the top, and the bolt hole at the bottom is farther away from the bend. So as I mentioned, this needs to be the bottom and the other side needs to be the top when you attach it to your bearing plate and motor mount plate. And we're going to start, there's 2 sets of holes. We're gonna start putting the cross braces in the left or the top side in this case. Same thing on the other side. Okay, we're now ready to set our assembled motor mount rails, cross supports into our orifice. We're just going to come in here and set it down. And as you notice, there's 2 sets of holes on each quadrant. So now we're going to attach one of the bottoms of our motor mount rails to the orifice. Bottom of the motor mount will go in the bottom holes and they will be plugged. Now we're going to install the hardware. We've got a bolt that goes through from the top through the hole, and then we've got a washer and a lock nut. And again, we're going to finger tight all 4 quadrants. As we used the bottom hole in the bottom quadrant, in the top of the fan, we're going to use the top hole, and the other 2 holes will be plugged there. And it's the same hardware. We're still going to just finger tighten for now. So after we installed our motor mount rails, remember we finger tightened those, then we're going to stand the fan up, and now we will go ahead and tighten the motor mount rail. We're going to align our motor mount and bearing mount, and on a knockdown version or one that's assembled in the field, you will receive some alignment tools, and these will be made to magnet in to these, and there's studs on them to fit into these holes on the motor mount rail and on the bearing plate, 1 for each side. Once those are in place, it lines and perfectly aligns these 2 motor mount plates to the motor rails. So now once we have these in, we can now tighten our hardware on the motor mount and the bearing plate. Next, we're going to be installing the bearing and shaft assembly. We have another jig to help properly align the shaft and bearings. On these middle holes there, again, you've got studs on this and some magnets to help hold it in place. We set that plate on, and then there's another 2 sets of plates that go on both sides. The bearings and shafts come pre-assembled and put together. The longer section of shaft will be sticking forward or out of the fan, which where the blade will attach. So now with that lined up, we can drop our hardware in, our nuts and our bolts. Okay, so now we've got our bearing in our jig, and we've got our bolts and nuts on finger tight. The key with all this is to make certain that we are aligning the blade perfectly within the orifice. There still is a little bit of movement in all this stuff, even with the jig. So when you tighten that jig down, you reduce the movement and help center it up even more perfectly. Now in this case, since I'm by myself and I don't have a second set of hands, I'm just going to use a little vice grip to hold that together good. And now you've really tightened up that tolerance. So now I'm going to go ahead and tighten up my nuts and bolts for the bearing. And then you can remove your alignment braces. Okay, we're now ready to assemble our fan blade. We have our key that will go in the shaft keyway, and make sure the bolts are facing outward. Okay, now the fan blade is slid onto the shaft. I've got my key in there. We want 7/8 of an inch of shaft sticking through the blade. Also, again, make sure your key is centered in the blade hub, and then we'll tighten that down with our wrench and make sure it's good and snug on there so it can't move. So now we're going to install our motor onto the motor mount. We're going to be using these 4 inside bolt holes for the motor. Just line that up. As we install the motor, we're also going to be installing our auto tensioner bracket. It is going to be mounted using the 2 front bolts that we're bolting the motor to the motor mount on. Once we put our nuts on, then we will tighten all those up. So now we're going to install our belt auto tensioner onto the bracket. Okay, now we're going to install the blade pulley. We got our key that's going to go in there. We're not going to tighten it down yet until we attach the motor pulley, and then we're going to align everything up. Okay, now we're going to put our motor pulley on, put our key in there, line that up. And again, before we tighten all these set screws, we got to make sure everything is in perfect alignment. Now we have our alignment tool that we used to align the motor mount and bearing mount. So we can also use this straight edge to align our pulleys and make sure that the blade pulley and the tensioner pulley are in alignment, and then also make sure that the blade pulley and motor pulley are in alignment. Now we're ready to begin installing our damper panels on our Mach 57. There are 3 magnets for the damper, and there is a nut and a bolt for the damper spring, and then there's also another little hole because these are interchangeable, be it left or right. So you have a plug for one hole and you've got a nut and a bolt for one hole. You are riveting in all of the damper magnets. Make certain that the rivet head is below the level of the magnet, because if not, the rivet is aluminum and it will not magnetize. It will prevent the magnet from adhering to the magnet bracket on the orifice. So just make certain that the rivet head is below the magnet, and if you have to, you could file down the rivet head a little bit if necessary. Okay, so now we're ready to install our damper panels. We have one damper panel already installed. Our second damper panel, we've slid the rod through. As you can see, both of these rods are for our damper panels. There is already a push nut on the top of both damper panel rods, and we are standing at the top of the fan at this moment. Okay, and as you note, we have one plug and we have one nut and bolt. The nut and bolt is on the bottom side hole that will line up with the damper panel strut eye bolt, so that way the spring will attach properly. Okay, so as we're down here now at the bottom edge of the damper panel assembly, on the bottom of the fan, we have 2 plastic washers that are going to slide on And then we're going to insert it into this bottom hole. We're going to put another push nut on the bottom of this, and then your damper panel will be installed. To install a few zip ties that will hold the rod to the damper panel. There's one at the bottom, one at the top, and one in the middle. And like I said, there's 2 holes that you thread your zip tie through, and it comes around the rod. All right, now we're going to install the damper panel spring on. We're going to just loop that around through your eye bolt, and you're going to stretch that over to your bolt that came through the damper panel. And remember, it needs to be in the lower hole. The upper hole will have a cap in it to just plug that hole. Then we're going to take another nut and just tighten that onto there. And we're good. So as we finish up our installation here, our assembly I should say, remember each pillow block bearing has a grease zerk on it, and you're supposed to grease those after about 500 hours of run time. Now you don't want to over grease those bearings because you can over grease it. There is also a grease zerk on the auto tensioner that you can grease periodically.